The tincture in Varric's cup caught the firelight wrong, the same way the healer's vial had caught it 4 days earlier, and I understood, with a cold and sudden certainty, exactly what I was looking at before anyone else in that hall did. "Do not drink that," I said, loud enough to carry, and watched Irik's hand freeze halfway to his mouth. Varric's face did something small and involuntary. A flicker of alarm quickly smoothed over, and I knew, in that instant, that I had just named the one thing he had been counting on no one in that hall recognizing. I did not know yet whether I had spoken in time. I only knew I had spent my last coin once already trying to save this man's life, and I was not about to watch a second attempt succeed where the river had failed. Let me tell you how I ended up in that hall. Because it started 4 days earlier, in a river cold enough to burn. I was 24, a weaver's daughter in the village of Hollowmere, and I had gone down to the crossing that morning for water the way I did every morning, with considerably more worry on my mind than usual. Because the coin in my pocket was the last I had until market day, and it was meant for rent, not for anything else. My mother had raised me alone since my father's death, the two of us stretching every coin further than it wanted to go. And I had learned early the particular arithmetic of a household with nothing extra in it, which meals could be smaller, which mending could wait another season, which small comforts simply were not going to happen this year. I had walked to that crossing 1,000 times, with exactly that arithmetic running quietly in the back of my mind. I had never once walked away from it, having spent the very last of what I owned. I found him face down in the shallows, half tangled in reeds, his horse nowhere in sight, and I did not think, pulling him free of that current, about who he was or what it would cost me. I only thought about the fact that he was not breathing, and that I had watched my own father drown in a river, not unlike this one, and I was not going to stand on that bank and let it happen twice. I got him onto the bank and pressed hard on his chest the way an old healer had once shown my mother, and when that alone did not bring the water up, I ran, soaked through and shaking, toward the travelling healer's cart that set up near the crossroads every 3rd day, and spent my last coin, every piece of it, meant for a roof that would now go unpaid. On a small vial of restorative tincture, the healer swore would clear his lungs if anything could. It worked. He coughed up river water and drew a ragged, desperate breath, and I remember feeling, in that single moment, more relief than I had felt in years over anyone, stranger or otherwise. I do not remember much after that. I remember the cold finally catching up to my own body, the exhaustion of the run, and the fear and the effort all arriving at once, and I remember someone's arms, and very little else. I woke in silk sheets. I want to be clear that nothing about my life had prepared me for silk sheets. I lay there for a long, disoriented moment, certain I had died and been mistaken for someone considerably more important, before a woman in a healer's apron noticed my eyes open and let out a small, startled sound. "She is awake," she called, to someone beyond the door, and within moments a man I did not recognize entered the chamber, tall, composed, studying me with the particular careful attention of someone assessing a puzzle he had not expected the morning to hand him. "You are in Stonemere Palace," he said, without preamble. "I am Doran, the king's second. You saved his life 4 days ago at the Hollowmere crossing." I sat up too fast, and the room tilted alarmingly. The man in the river. He is, I leave, recovering, considerably more so than he would be without your intervention. Something in Doran's face eased slightly, though not entirely. You should know, before anyone else explains it to you less gently, that the man you pulled from that river is King Eirik of Stonemere, and that an old law of this land now binds the two of you together in ways neither of you had any say in choosing. "What law?" I said, my voice considerably steadier than I felt. "A life debt claim," Doran said. ancient, rarely invoked, and absolute. Whoever saves a king's life at the direct risk of losing their own is owed a debt the crown cannot simply dismiss. And until that debt is formally settled by the council, the one who saved him cannot leave the protection of the crown that owes it. You are not a prisoner, precisely, but you are not, at present, free to simply walk home either. I did not understand, that first disoriented morning, exactly how large a complication I had just become. I would understand soon enough. I asked Doran, before he left me to rest, the question that had been circling underneath every other thought since I woke. My family. Do they know where I am? I have a mother in Hollowmere who will assume the worst if I simply do not come home. A rider was sent the same evening you were brought here, he said. She has been informed you are safe, recovering under the Crown's own protection. I would not have left that unattended. I felt something in my chest ease slightly at that, though not entirely, because safe under the Crown's protection and free to go home were, I was beginning to understand, two considerably different conditions. Eirik came to see me himself, later that same day, and I understood, the moment he entered the chamber, exactly what kind of man I had pulled out of that river. He moved the way I imagined mountains would move if they ever bothered to, slow and deliberate and entirely certain of the space he occupied, and yet there was something careful in the way he held himself in that doorway, as though uncertain whether he was owed the right to simply walk in. I am told I owe you my life, he said, and I am told, in the same breath, that the debt now traps you here regardless of what either of us wants. I find I do not know which fact to apologize for first. You could start with the part where I nearly died of the cold saving you, I said, and work your way up to the part where I apparently cannot go home now. Something flickered across his face, brief and startled, the closest thing to a laugh I would come to learn he allowed himself easily. That is, I think, the first entirely honest thing anyone has said to me since I woke in this bed myself. I did not do it to trap either of us, I said. I did it because you were not breathing, and I could not stand on that bank and watch it happen the way I once watched my own father drown. Something in his face shifted at that, softened in a way I had not expected from a king. I am sorry. For your father, and for the debt this law has placed on you, without your consent. I did not ask for it any more than you did. I would like that understood plainly, before anything else about this situation grows more complicated than it already is. I did not know, sitting in that borrowed silk-sheeted bed, exactly how much more complicated it was about to become. I remained at Stonemere far longer than the council's formal proceedings alone accounted for, because Eirik, once recovered enough to stand unassisted, made no particular effort to speed the debt settlement, and I found, with some private embarrassment, that I did not mind the delay nearly as much as I had expected to. Those first days taught me more about a king's life than I had ever wanted to know. Eirik ruled Stonemere the way I imagined most men his size ruled anything, through sheer unhurried presence, rather than volume. A king who did not need to raise his voice, because the room had already decided to listen before he opened his mouth. Around me, though, that unhurried presence kept slipping. I caught him twice forgetting the end of a sentence midway through, watching me instead of whatever formal matter had brought him to my chamber that day. And I found I did not mind being the reason a king's composure occasionally misplaced itself. His wolf, weak in those first days from the near drowning, attached itself to me with an intensity that mortified him considerably more than it bothered me. It refused to settle for any hand but mine when it needed tending, growled softly at anyone else who approached his sickbed too quickly, and once, memorably, dragged an entire blanket across the room to deposit at my feet in the middle of a formal physician's examination, an act so undignified that even the stone-faced court physician had to turn away to hide his own laughter. I do not know what has gotten into him, Eirik said, mortified, on the third such occasion, watching his own wolf refuse to release the hem of my sleeve. "I believe the technical term is gratitude," I said, though it does seem to be expressing itself with considerably more drama than the situation strictly requires. "It has never done this before," he admitted. "Not once, in my whole life, has it attached itself to anyone the way it has attached itself to you in 4 days." I did not know what to do with that observation, so I simply kept tending the wolf and let the observation sit between us the way I would learn. Over the following days, most true things between us liked to sit, quietly, unforced, until one of us finally said them plainly. The most memorable incident came on the 6th morning, when the wolf, apparently deciding that gratitude required a physical offering, dragged an enormous joint of roasted venison clean off the kitchen's serving table and deposited it, with visible pride, directly at the foot of my bed, scattering 3 startled kitchen maids and 1 very unamused steward in its wake. Eirik arrived moments later, drawn by the commotion, and stood in the doorway surveying the scene, his own wolf sitting beside a stolen joint of meat, tail wagging with an enthusiasm no king's composure had ever survived witnessing in public, with an expression caught somewhere between horror and helpless affection. "I would like it on record," he said, "that I have never once stolen meat from my own kitchens to impress anyone." "Your wolf appears to feel differently about the strategy's merits," I said, and could not keep the laughter out of my voice, and watched something in him ease at the sound of it, as though my laughing at his expense were somehow the very thing he had been hoping for all along. It was Doran who explained, more fully, exactly how tangled the situation had become. "There is a betrothal," he told me on the 5th day, choosing his words with the particular care of a man delivering news he suspected would not land gently. "Arranged 18 months ago, to the eldest daughter of the Vashdor house, brokered largely by Lord Varric, who has served this council since the old king's time. It secures trade rights along the eastern passes that Stonemere badly needs. Your life debt claim, unresolved, now legally supersedes it, and Varric is not a man who accepts an obstacle to his own careful arrangements gracefully." "I did not ask to become an obstacle," I said. "I am aware," Doran said. "I would simply ask you to be careful regardless. A man who spent 18 months securing an alliance does not enjoy watching a weaver's daughter unmake it by accident." I did not fully understand the warning's weight until I met Lord Varric myself, 2 days later, in a corridor he had clearly been waiting in. He was pleasant in the particular way that makes a threat land harder than open hostility would, complimenting my composure, my modest bearing, the admirable quickness of my actions at the river, before arriving, with practiced smoothness at the point. "It would be a kindness to everyone," he said, "if you were to formally waive the life debt claim. The Crown would compensate you generously, of course. Considerably more than a weaver's daughter typically sees in a lifetime. It would spare you the burden of a court entirely unsuited to your upbringing, and spare the kingdom a diplomatic complication it can ill afford." "That is a great deal of concern for my burden," I said, from a man I have known for considerably less than 5 minutes. Something in his smile went very still. "Consider it, all the same," he said, and left without waiting for an answer. I found Eirik that same evening and told him plainly what had been suggested to me. "He has approached you already," Eirik said, his jaw tightening in a way I had not yet seen from him. I suspected he might. I did not expect it this soon. "Should I be considering it?" I asked. "The waiver. It would solve your betrothal problem cleanly enough." He was quiet a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had lost the careful formality he usually wore in front of anyone but me. "I do not want you to waive it," he said. "I have spent 5 days telling myself that wanting you to stay is simply gratitude, or the wolf's confusion, or the strangeness of the debt itself. I do not believe that any longer. I would like you to stay, because I have not stopped thinking about the sound of your voice telling me you would not watch it happen twice, and I find I am considerably less interested in a betrothal that secures trade rights than I am in a woman who spent her last coin on a stranger. I did not have an answer ready for that, so I said nothing, and let the quiet hold it instead. The way quiet had held most true things between us since the day I woke in silk sheets I had never asked for. If you want to find out whether Rosalind ever managed to go home at all, and what nearly finished the job the river started, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when an old law traps two people together who never asked for any of it, and one of them starts wondering if he minds. I began, in the days that followed, quietly asking my own questions about the accident that had put Eirik in that river at all. Mostly because something about the timing of Varric's visit to me had not settled easily in my mind. It was Doran, checking the stable records at my urging, who found the detail that finally mattered. The horse that had thrown Eirik near the crossing, according to the stable master's own log, had shown symptoms consistent with a rare sedating route in the days before the ride. A route not naturally found in Stonemere's pastures, but kept, in small, careful quantities, in exactly one private stable in the kingdom, belonging to Lord Varric himself. I sat with that discovery a long time, understanding, with the particular cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it, that the man who had approached me so pleasantly about waiving my claim had very likely arranged the very accident the claim now protected me from. Something in me that had spent 5 days simply adjusting to a strange new life stopped adjusting quietly. I brought the stable log to Eirik myself. His face, reading it, went colder than I had yet seen it. He nearly killed me, he said, to clear the way for a betrothal that benefits his own trade interests as much as the Crown's, and then approached the woman who saved me from his own scheme, asking her to erase the one piece of leverage standing between him and finishing what he started. He will not accept losing that leverage quietly, I said. Not if he was willing to go this far already. Then we will not give him a quiet way to take it back. His jaw set in the particular way I had learned, over those days, meant a decision had already been made. I am done letting my own counsel decide the shape of my life while I recover from what one of them very nearly did to end it. We did not move quickly. Doran cautioned repeatedly against confronting Varric with anything less than proof strong enough to survive his own considerable skill at deflection, and so those next days passed in a careful, quiet accumulation, stable hands questioned individually, physicians' records cross-checked against council attendance the week of the ride. Small threads gathered one at a time until they might hold real weight. I found the waiting harder than I expected. I had spent my whole life reacting to trouble the moment it appeared, rather than watching it approach slowly, and the patience this required did not come naturally to me at all. Varric moved again within the week, once the waiver request had clearly failed, and the stable log threatened to reach the full council. He came to me himself, one evening, with a cup of warmed wine he claimed was a gift from the kitchens, apologising, with practised smoothness, for the bluntness of his earlier approach. I did not drink it. Something about the careful way he watched me lift the cup, the faint sheen catching the firelight wrong, reminded me too closely of a healer's vial I had once spent my last coin on, and I set it down untouched, citing a headache I did not actually have. He left disappointed, and I understood, watching him go, that whatever he had intended that cup to do, it had very nearly worked, simply because I trusted a stranger's kindness more readily than I trusted my own instincts. The second attempt came 3 nights later, in the Great Hall, during a formal council gathering where Varric, cornered by the stable logs mounting evidence, apparently decided a more direct solution had become necessary. Not for me this time, but for the king himself, delivered through a cup passed across the same table where the life debt's fate was about to be formally decided. That is the scene I told you about at the very start of this. The tincture catching firelight wrong, my own voice, louder than I expected it to be, telling Eirik not to drink. The hall had gone utterly still in the half-second after I spoke, every eye moving between the cup, Varric's face, and mine, and I felt, for one long breath, the particular terror of having spoken a truth loudly enough that there was no way to take it back if I had somehow been wrong. I had not been wrong. I watched that certainty land on Varric's face at the same moment it landed on mine, and understood we had both just run out of quiet ways to resolve this. Doran had the cup seized and tested within the hour, and the poison found within it matched, precisely, a rare compound recorded in Varric's own private physician's stores, the same physician, it emerged under questioning, who had quietly supplied the sedating root used against Eiric's horse weeks earlier. Varric's composure, so carefully maintained through every prior confrontation, finally broke entirely under the weight of two matching pieces of evidence laid before the full council in a single evening. "I built that trade alliance for this crown's benefit," he said, backing toward the hall's edge as guards closed around him. "A weaver's daughter and a debt no one asked for nearly cost this kingdom everything I secured for it." "You nearly cost this kingdom its king," Eiric said, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous, twice, to protect an alliance that profited your own house as much as the crown. "I would ask the council to consider whether a man that willing to poison his own king over an inconvenience was ever truly serving anyone but himself." He had no answer ready for that. I do not think he had ever expected to be named so plainly, in front of witnesses, by the very king he had tried twice to remove. Varric was stripped of his council seat and his standing that same hour, his household investigated in full, and the betrothal to the Vashdor house was quietly dissolved once it became clear exactly how it had been secured. He was escorted from Stonemere's halls before dawn, in considerably less finery than he had worn delivering that cup of warmed wine. Eiric found me afterward in the same chamber where I had first woken in silk sheets, holding the small empty glass vial I had kept, unthinking, in my pocket since the day at the river. "I have spent 9 days trying to prove to you that this was never only a debt," he said. "I did not intend nearly losing my own life a second time to be the demonstration." "It worked anyway," I said, "though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it." He looked at the vial still in my hand, then at me, something in his face finally losing the last of its reluctant, careful formality. "I do not know how to properly court a woman the law has already bound to me. I have spent 9 days trying to work out how to make you want to stay for reasons that have nothing to do with any debt at all." "You already worked it out," I said. "You told me plainly that you wanted me to stay before you had any proof it was safe to say so. That is the only thing you ever needed to do." When he kissed me, careful and certain, a man who had spent 9 days calling gratitude by every name except the true one, I felt something in my own chest, some quiet disbelief I had carried since the moment I woke in a bed I had never asked to sleep in. "Finally settle." He claimed me before the full restored court a month later, his hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had watched an ancient law drag a weaver's daughter into their king's life and stay there entirely on its own merit. Doran stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time in 9 days, entirely unworried. My mother travelled from Hollowmere for the ceremony itself, arriving 3 days early and spending most of that time, I was told later, quietly interrogating every servant in the castle about whether her daughter was truly being treated well or simply told she was. She found no evidence to the contrary, though I suspect she would have said so regardless, having decided somewhere on the journey that any king who owed his life to her daughter had better earn the privilege of keeping her. 6 months later, I stood at the same river crossing where I had once spent my last coin on a stranger, holding a letter from my mother in one hand and the small glass vial, empty still, in the other. My mother's letter asked, carefully, whether it was true her daughter, once so worried about a single missed rent payment, was Queen of Stonemere now. I wrote back that it was true, and that the roof in question had been repaired anyway, along with every other roof in Hollowmere, because a king who owed his life to a village had not forgotten which village it was. Doran had stopped bracing every time Varric's name came up in council proceedings, mostly now that the man sat stripped of standing rather than seated at that table. The old life debt law, at Eiric's own insistence, had been formally revised to include a clear path to release for anyone who wished to take it, so that no future rescue would ever again trap a stranger against her will. And Stonemere's court, once so easily steadied by a patient schemer's careful arrangements, had grown considerably more careful about mistaking ambition for loyalty. Eiric's wolf had not, in all those months, grown any more dignified about my presence. It still refused to settle for anyone else's hand when it was tired, still trailed me through the castle corridors with an attentiveness the court had long since stopped finding remarkable, and Eiric still pretended, every single time, to be faintly embarrassed by behaviour he had privately admitted. More than once, he had no actual desire to correct. I had, in those months, become something of an informal advocate for Hollowmere and the villages like it. Sitting in on council sessions whenever matters of rural allotments or river safety arose, insisting, more than once, that a kingdom which nearly lost its king to a river crossing owed its people considerably better maintained banks and considerably faster access to healers than most villages had ever been granted. Eiric had not once argued the point. He had simply signed whatever I put in front of him, which Doran found endlessly amusing and never once let either of us forget. I turned the small empty vial over in my fingers and thought about the woman who had run barefoot to a healer's cart 4 days into an ordinary week, certain of nothing except that she was not going to watch a stranger drown the way she had once watched her father. She had no idea that freezing morning, that spending her last coin on a man she did not know, was about to become the richest decision of her life. She only knew she could not walk away from the riverbank. I like to think she would be glad now that she never learned how to leave a drowning man to the current. Do you think Eiric's wolf would have chosen me the way it did if I had simply been a passing stranger, or had some part of it already sensed exactly who was pulling him out of that water? Tell me your theory in the comments. And if you want to stay at this crossing a little longer, comment the vial and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for standing on that riverbank with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Stonemere. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills who owe their lives to someone who never meant to become the centre of one, and I intend to tell you every one of their stories. Dacian's men had me backed against the wet stone of the alley wall, and the rain had not let up once since the moment I first heard footsteps behind me that were not my own. You are still the auction house's property, the taller one said, until a formal claim is entered. You do not get to simply walk away from that. I already walked away from considerably worse than you, I said, and it was true. And it was also, I understood even as I said it, not going to be enough on its own to get me out of that alley. Somewhere beyond the wall, I heard a sound that did not belong to any ordinary night, low, furious, closing fast, and understood that whatever happened next, I was not facing it alone after all. Let me tell you how I ended up in that alley, because it started 6 days earlier, on a stage in the rain-soaked square of Hollow Cross, where not a single hand went up for me. I was 23, and I had spent the year before that stage learning exactly what it costs an Omega when the man who was supposed to claim her stands in front of the whole village and says, plainly, that he has changed his mind. It is called the reckoning, in villages like mine, an old custom, half-shamed even by the people who still practiced it, in which an Omega rejected and left unclaimed for a full year is auctioned into a household's indentured service, her labour sold to offset the dishonour her family is assumed to carry for the rejection. I had spent that year working my father's forge to the bone, rather than sit idle, waiting for some other man to want me, and it had not mattered in the slightest. The year ended. The auction proceeded exactly as tradition demanded. My own rejection had come from a man named Roswell, a tanner's son I had known since childhood, who had courted me for the better part of a year before standing up at a village gathering and announcing, without warning, that he had changed his mind and intended to court the miller's daughter instead. He had not been cruel about it. Exactly. He had simply been thoughtless, the way men are thoughtless when they have never once had to consider what a public rejection costs the person left standing in front of everyone who witnessed it. My father had not fought the custom on my behalf. He had simply grown quieter around me as the year wore on. As though my unclaimed status were a debt he too was somehow expected to pay down through silence. I stood on that stage in the rain, soaked through, my shoes already off because the stage boards were slick enough to break an ankle on, and waited for a hand to rise. None did. I do not fully know why, standing there, I expected it to hurt as much as it did. I had told myself for weeks that I did not care whether anyone bid, that indentured service to a stranger's household could hardly be worse than another year of my own village's pity. I discovered, standing on those wet boards in total silence, that I had been lying to myself rather thoroughly. The auctioneer cleared his throat, some formal phrase about default claim rising to his lips. And I decided, in that exact moment, that I was not going to stand there and listen to him finish it. I picked up my shoes. I walked off that stage, down through the stunned, rain-soaked crowd, and did not look back once, not even when I heard, somewhere behind me, a voice raised in something that might have been protest and might have simply been surprise. I did not know, walking away, that the voice belonged to a king. The rain had not eased at all by then, and my bare feet on the cobblestones had gone numb enough that I barely felt the cold anymore. Only the particular hollow ache of a night that had taken considerably more from me than I had walked into that square expecting to lose. I did not slow down. I did not, at first, even notice the footsteps behind me over the sound of my own blood in my ears. I made it 3 streets before I heard footsteps behind me, unhurried but deliberate, matching my pace exactly, and turned, finally, soaked through, and considerably less composed than I wanted to be, to find a tall man in plain travelling clothes standing several paces back. Rain running freely down a face that looked, more than anything, stricken. "You should not be out here alone," he said. "Not in this weather, not after what just happened on that stage." "I am considerably safer out here alone," I said, than I was standing on that stage waiting to find out which household I would belong to by morning. "I would like to be left to my own company, if it is all the same to you." It is not, actually, all the same to me. Something in his voice cracked slightly, an honesty I did not expect from a stranger. "I am King Thorn of Hollowcross. I was seated in that square tonight fully intending to bid on you, and I did not manage it in time, and I have been trying to work out every step behind you since, how to explain that without it sounding like an excuse." I stopped walking. "You intended to bid." "My wolf recognized you the moment you were brought onto that stage," he said. I have not felt that particular certainty in over 3 years. I froze instead of raising my hand, and by the time I found my voice, you had already walked off the stage, and the auction had closed with no claim entered. I do not have a satisfying reason for the delay. I only have the truth of it, which is considerably less flattering. I did not know what to do with that confession, standing in the rain with my shoes still in my hand. So I said the only honest thing I had left in me. I do not know how to trust a man's sudden interest after a room full of them just watched me stand unclaimed and said nothing at all. "I would not ask you to trust it tonight," he said. "I would only ask you to let me walk you somewhere dry and explain myself properly, before either of us catches a fever standing in this street arguing about it." I did not fully believe him. I was also, by then, cold enough that pride alone was not going to get me through the night, and I let him lead me to a modest inn 2 streets over, where the innkeeper's eyes went wide enough at the sight of her king dripping in the doorway that I nearly laughed despite everything. 3 years ago, he told me, that first night, staring at the fire rather than at me, I lost my mate to a fever no healer in this territory could break. I held her through the worst of it and could do nothing but watch. I have not let myself want anything the way my wolf wanted you tonight since the day I buried her, and when the moment finally came to act on it, some part of me that has spent 3 years terrified of loss simply refused to move. That is not a flattering explanation, I said, but it is at least an honest one. I have had considerably more practice at honesty than at courtship, he admitted, something almost rueful in his voice. I do not know how to properly pursue a woman I nearly lost through my own hesitation. I only know I do not intend to hesitate a second time. What was she like, I asked, because it seemed, somehow, the kinder question to ask than anything about myself. Your first mate. Something in his face softened, remembering rather than guarding for once. Steady, she ran this household with a patience I never had, and she was the only person alive who could make me laugh at my own self-seriousness without it landing as an insult. I have spent 3 years turning her into a wound I simply avoid touching. You are the first person who has asked me to remember her as a person instead. Then tell me more, I said. And he did, quietly, for a long while, the fire burning low between us, and I found myself, without quite deciding to, telling him in turn about the year of pity I had endured in my own village. The particular loneliness of being talked about, rather than talked to. I did not answer him plainly about what any of it meant for the two of us, still too raw from the stage and the silence that had led to it, but I found, over the following days, that I did not want to leave Hollow Cross nearly as urgently as I had wanted to walk away from that auction. Asmund, Thorn's second, explained to me, gently but plainly, exactly how precarious my situation actually was. The auction house retains legal claim over you until a formal petition is entered and approved by the local magistrate, he said. The king's intent to bid, expressed after the gavel, does not automatically override that claim. We will need to petition properly, which takes time, and I would ask you to be careful in the meantime. The man who runs that auction house, Lord Dacian, is not known for accepting lost income gracefully. I did not fully understand the weight of that warning until Dacian himself sought me out, 4 days later, in the inn's modest common room. He arrived unannounced, dressed with the particular understated wealth of a man who wanted his money noticed, without appearing to want it noticed, and the innkeeper's easy manner toward her other guests vanished entirely the moment his name was given at the door. He was smooth in the particular way that makes a threat land harder than open hostility would, expressing polite concern for my welfare. My uncertain legal status, the considerable inconvenience and unresolved claim caused his household's accounts. It would be simplest, he said, if you return to the auction house voluntarily while the king's petition proceeds through proper channels. I can offer considerably more comfortable accommodations than an inn can provide. I have seen how your household treats women it claims comfortable accommodations for, I said, though I had, in truth, only heard rumours, dark ones, about the auction house's back rooms and the women who passed through them and were rarely spoken of again. I will wait here, thank you. Something in his smile went very still. Consider it, regardless, he said, and left without waiting for an answer. I sat with that visit a long while after he left, turning it over the way I might have turned over a coin of foreign make, uncertain what it was actually worth. Something about his careful concern for my welfare had not sat easily beside the rumours I had heard, and I found myself, that evening, considerably more unsettled than the conversation's polite surface should have left me. I found Thorn that same evening and told him plainly what had been suggested to me. He has approached you already, Thorn said, his jaw tightening in a way I had not yet seen from him. I suspected he might, once word of the delayed petition spread. I did not expect it this soon. Should I return, I asked, while the petition proceeds? It would resolve the standoff cleanly enough. He was quiet a long moment, and when he answered, his voice had lost the careful formality he usually wore in front of anyone but me. "I do not want you anywhere near that man's household," he said. "I have spent 4 days telling myself that wanting you safe is simply guilt over my own hesitation at the auction. I do not believe that any longer. I would like you to stay, because I have not stopped thinking, since the moment you walked off that stage with your shoes still in your hand, that I have never once seen anyone choose their own dignity over comfort that plainly, and I find I am considerably more interested in that woman than in a petition's proper channels." I did not have an answer ready for that, so I said nothing, and let the quiet hold it the way quiet had held most true things between us since the night he first followed me into the rain. If you want to find out whether Sable ever managed to walk fully away from that auction house's claim on her, and what Thorne's wolf did the night it finally mattered most, stay with me through to the end of this. Follow along so you do not lose the thread of what happens when a king who froze once decides he is done freezing. I began, in the days that followed, quietly asking my own questions about Dacian's auction house, mostly because something about the smoothness of his visit had not settled easily in my mind. It was Asmund, following threads through the local magistrate's records at my urging, who found the detail that finally mattered. Every registered bidder present at my auction, it turned out, had been visited privately in the days beforehand by men in Dacian's employ, each conversation ending by more than one witness's account, with a quiet reminder of debts owed to the auction house, or favours that might be called in, should a bid be raised against Dacian's own private arrangements. My auction had not gone unbid by chance. It had been engineered to go unbid entirely, so that the fallback claim would default directly to the auction house Dacian controlled, a pattern Asmund discovered with growing unease. That matched at least 3 prior reckonings in villages along the same trade route, each one ending with an unclaimed omega quietly disappearing into Dacian's household and never being seen in public again. I sat with that discovery a long time, understanding, with the particular cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it, that I had not simply been unwanted that night. I had been engineered to appear unwanted, deliberately, by a man who profited from exactly that appearance. I thought back to the faces of the men seated in that square, several of whom I had known my whole life, and understood now why more than one of them had looked away from the stage rather than meet my eyes. I had spent a full year believing my own village had simply decided I was not worth claiming. I understood now that at least part of that silence had been bought, quietly, in advance, and the knowledge did not make the humiliation of that stage any easier to carry, only considerably angrier. Something in me that had spent days simply grateful to be somewhere dry and safe stopped being only grateful. I brought the findings to Thorne myself. His face, reading them, went colder than I had yet seen it. "He has been harvesting rejected omegas from this entire trade route for years," he said. "Hiding behind a custom my own crown has been too slow to formally abolish." And I very nearly handed him another one through my own hesitation. "Then let us make certain he does not finish what he started," I said, and felt, saying it, something steadier settling into place where the fear had been. Dacian moved first, formally, once he realised the magistrate's records were being examined too closely for comfort. He filed the auction house's claim over me directly with the Crown's own court, citing the unresolved petition and demanding immediate transfer of custody while the matter was properly adjudicated, a legal manoeuvre, Asmund explained grimly, that would very likely succeed on paper long enough to get me back behind his household's walls before anyone could stop it. Thorne contested it publicly, before the same court, refusing the transfer and demanding the magistrate's records be opened to full review before any custody changed hands. The court session itself was tense enough that I chose not to attend, pacing instead in the inn's small common room while Asmund sent word of each development as it happened. It bought us time. It did not, apparently, buy us safety. Dacian's men found me 3 nights later, in the alley behind the inn, where I had gone alone to fetch water rather than wait on the innkeeper's overworked staff. I had grown, in those days, more confident in the Crown's protection than the situation actually warranted, certain that a man with a claim already contested publicly in court would not risk anything so brazen, while the matter remained unresolved. I understood, the moment a hand closed hard around my arm from behind, exactly how wrong that confidence had been. That is the scene I told you about at the very beginning of this, the wet stone at my back, the taller man's grip, the sound beyond the wall that did not belong to any ordinary night. Thorn's wolf cleared that alley wall in a single motion that sent Dacian's men scattering, and Thorn himself arrived a half-second behind it, hauling the man still gripping my arm away from me with a force that left no question about how close he had come to losing every ounce of composure he still possessed. "You sent men to seize her from an inn's own alley," Thorn said, his voice gone very quiet and very dangerous, "while your claim sits unresolved in my own court. I would very much like every witness gathering here to remember exactly what that tells them about a man who profits from women no one raises a hand for." Asmund arrived moments later with enough of the castle guard to make certain no second attempt followed the first, and it was in front of that gathered crowd, inn staff, alarmed neighbours, and Decian's own retreating men. That Thorn's wolf finally did what it had failed to do on that rain-soaked stage 6 days earlier. It crossed the alley, sat directly at my feet, and lowered its head to the wet stone in front of every witness present, an open, undeniable claim no court record could later dispute or reframe as a technicality. "I froze once," Thorn said. "Quiet now. Only for me, though the whole alley could hear it. I am not freezing again." Dacian's auction house was seized under formal Crown order within the week. The magistrate's records made public evidence against every prior reckoning he had quietly engineered, and 3 other women from villages along that same trade route were found in his household's back rooms, frightened but alive, freed at last from a captivity that had gone unquestioned for considerably longer than it should have. Dacian himself was stripped of his holdings and his standing, escorted from Hollow Cross in considerably less comfort than the auction house he had run for years. Thorn found me afterward in the same inn where all the true things between us had begun, holding the plain leather shoes I had carried off that stage, rather than let the wet boards take them from me. "I have spent 6 days trying to prove to you that I was not simply a man who hesitated once and regretted it," he said. "I do not think nearly losing you in an alley was the demonstration I had intended." "It worked anyway," I said, "though I would ask you not to repeat it. I do not intend to make a habit of it." He looked at the shoes still in my hands, then at me. Something in his face finally losing the last of its grief-worn caution. I do not know how to properly court a woman who walked off an auction stage rather than wait to be chosen. I have spent 6 days trying to work out how to be worth the choosing instead. "You already managed it," I said. "You told me the truth about why you froze, and you have not stopped showing up since. That is the only thing you ever needed to do." When he kissed me, careful and certain, a man who had spent 3 years afraid of exactly this and had finally decided the fear was not going to win, I felt something in my chest, some old defended distance I had built the night no hand rose for me, finally settle. He claimed me before the full court a month later. His hand steady on the old iron circlet as he set it on my head himself, in front of every noble who had heard, by then, exactly how their grieving king had chased an unclaimed Omega through the rain, rather than let his own hesitation cost him twice. Asmund stood near the front of that hall, looking, for the first time in 6 days, entirely unworried. Not every voice in that hall welcomed it easily. One elderly duke asked, pointedly, whether a king ought to build his household around a woman first found unclaimed at a rejected Omega auction. Thorn answered him himself, plainly, before I had even decided whether the question deserved a response at all, that the very custom the Duke referenced had just been proven, publicly, to be a mechanism for trafficking rather than tradition, and that he intended to spend his reign making certain no other woman's worth was ever again measured by a silent room's cowardice. The Duke did not raise the subject again. 6 months later, I stood in that same square where the auction stage had once stood, now cleared and repaved, holding a letter from my father in one hand and the plain leather shoes, resoled and cared for now, in the other. My father's letter asked, carefully, whether it was true that the daughter no one bid on was Queen of Hollowcross now. I wrote back that it was true, and that the reckoning itself had been formally abolished by royal decree before the season's end, so that no other Omega would ever again stand where I once stood, waiting for a hand that might not rise. Asmund had stopped bracing every time Dacian's name came up in court proceedings, mostly, now that the man sat stripped of standing rather than running an auction house. The 3 women found in his household had each been given the Crown's own support in rebuilding whatever life the reckoning had once stolen from them, and I made a point of visiting each of them myself, when I could, because I understood better than most exactly what that particular silence costs a person. And Hollowcross, once a village that had watched me stand unclaimed in the rain without a single hand rising, had quietly become known instead for the Queen, who had simply picked up her shoes and kept walking rather than wait for anyone's permission to matter. My father visited twice in those 6 months, considerably more careful with his words than he had ever been while I lived under his roof. And though I had not forgotten the year of pity I endured with his quiet participation, I found I did not need to hold it against him forever to hold it at all. Thorn never once pushed me toward a reconciliation faster than I wanted to move through it. The same patience he had shown me since the night he first followed me through the rain, and I had come to understand that patience as the truest measure of the man beneath the crown. Thorn's wolf, for its part, had never fully returned to whatever careful restraint had governed it for 3 grieving years. It still crossed rooms without permission whenever it decided I had been out of its sight too long, still settled at my feet during council sessions with a devotion the court had stopped finding remarkable, and I had come to understand that particular lack of restraint not as an embarrassment, but as the truest apology a king's wolf knew how to give for the one night it had failed to move in time. I had taken, in those 6 months, to keeping the square's repaved stones free of any marker or memorial, at my own insistence, so that the place would simply become an ordinary part of the village again, rather than a monument to what had once happened there. Some wounds heal better without a plaque reminding everyone where they occurred. I preferred to let the square belong to market days and children playing, rather than to the night it had once tried to define me by. I turned the worn leather shoes over in my hands and thought about the woman who had stood on that stage 6 months earlier, soaked to the bone, certain of nothing, except that she was not going to wait 1 more second for a room full of silence to decide her worth. She had no idea, that rain-soaked night, that walking away was about to become the exact thing that made a king finally move. She only knew she was done standing still for people who would not choose her. I like to think she would be glad, now that she never looked back. Do you think Thorn would have found his courage eventually, on his own? Or did he need to watch me walk away first to understand exactly what freezing had nearly cost him? Tell me your theory in the comments, and if you want to stay in this rain a little longer, comment the shoes and I will know exactly what you are asking for. Thank you for walking through that storm with me. Wherever you are listening from tonight, welcome to Hollowcross. Follow along for the next story from this side of the border. There are more kings in these hills learning, sometimes too slowly, that the ones worth chasing are usually the ones who stop waiting to be chosen. And I intend to tell you every one of their stories.